Hi everybody, welcome to the first block in our 2026 Perfectly Pieced Mystery Quilt. Since this is our first block, I'm going to take a couple extra minutes to go over some things that we'll be using all year long before we jump into the block tutorial. Quick note, I will be making this month's featured project, but since not everyone has received their files yet, I thought I'd start out with our block tutorial for the mystery quilt. When I do make the featured project, I'll be selecting completely different fabrics, and I'll talk a little bit about how to pick fabrics for this particular design. There'll be a link in the description box below where you can download information on this mystery quilt project. It has the two layouts, lap quilt, ladder quilt, and information about fabrics and borders. There's also a link included in this file and in the description box below for my Facebook group. Please join the Facebook group so we can all share our mystery quilt projects. There is a security question. You have to answer the security question. In the first video, we talked about selecting fabrics. If you haven't watched it, I'll link that below. Go ahead and watch it. One thing I did forget to mention is if you're not sure what kind of fabrics to pick, in addition to selecting a fat quarter bundle, you could select something for your favorite holiday. Halloween, Christmas, Valentine's Day, 4th of July, Easter, or maybe you know somebody who's got a little girl. You could pick little girl fabrics, a little boy fabrics. You can look around your house, pick a favorite decor item. Maybe you've got a punch needle or a Kimberbell pillow and you really like the colors. You can base your fabric choices off of that. You can also go to the internet and look up seasonal color palettes, and you'll be able to look at pictures. They almost look like paint swatches, and they've got all the different colors and everything coordinates. That's a great way to pick fabric. And as I did mention, this is a great project for your scraps. As you're making it, if it looks like absolutely nothing will go together, when you put your quilt together at the end, it's going to look fantastic. I'm going to be making the lap quilt throughout the year. There's an option for a lap quilt and a ladder quilt. I'll be using an 8-inch block unless it's something where you need the little 4-inch blocks to make the complete design. If you have a machine with only a 5x7 hoop, let's say you can make the 4-inch blocks but you can't make an 8-inch block, you can make 4-inch blocks each month, and you have an option with that. This month is the little teacup, and I'm drawing sideways and I can't draw, so this is going to look horrible. But let's say you make 2 teacup blocks. These would be the 4-inch size. And for these blocks, if you don't want to make 4 teacups, you could just pick pieces of fabric and use the included quilting that comes with Perfectly Pieced. For the blocks, there's always an option of just the block with the quilting that goes with that block, and I'll show you that on the machine when we get started. And then they also give you regular background quilting files. So if you're working with smaller blocks, that'll give you an option not only to showcase the piece block, but the background quilting, and then we'll be using borders for each month. At the end of the year, it's going to be like a library of everything you got for your Perfectly Pieced subscription. For my batting, I'm using Missouri Star Quilter's Best Blend. It's an 80/20. It's really flat. It's very similar to Kimberbell project batting. Every so often, Missouri Star puts their batting on sale, and I'll grab a bunch. I do long arm quilting. I love to have it handy. I would recommend Kimberbell project batting or this Quilter's Best Blend. It works out very well. For my stabilizer, I'm going to be using this HBI stabilizer. It's called No Show Mesh medium weight. This one is 15 by 25 inches. I did get this on Amazon. I don't live anywhere near a craft store. I do shop at lots of quilt shops online, but sometimes I need to order something and get it the next day. This is very similar to Kimberbell's light mesh cutaway. I do love Kimberbell's light mesh cutaway, but I don't have enough for this project. I always have one of these in my sewing room as a backup. I've got a couple pair of scissors I like to use, the double curved applique and snips. I'll link these below. These are Kimberbell scissors, and my threads will change each month, but I'll be sure to let you know what I'm using. This month I'm going to be using Glide Pearl for the block and the block quilting, and for my borders I'm going to use this Floriani pink. Let me show you how I'm organizing everything, and then we'll jump in and make our block. I have one of these nice bags, the Oh So Delightful bags. That's another quilt that's on my list to make. Let me know if you have that one. I'm keeping all my fabric in here. Let me show you. This is for my borders. This is a bolt of Kona bone. Great places to watch for sales for bolts of fabric. Missouri Star Quilt Company and Green Fairy Quilts. Green Fairy Quilts is also a great option to buy fat quarter bundles. Sometimes they're not the newest and they may take a little longer to ship, but they are really good with their customer service. I've bought from them for a long time. I've also purchased from Fat Quarter Shop, Shabby Fabrics, Reb's Fab Stash, and lots of independent Etsy sellers. If you've got a favorite place for fabric or even just fabric bolts, leave it in the comments below for everyone. I've got my batting right here. Here's my fat quarter bundle. I'm using Gentler Times by Lori Holt. I showed that in the very first video. And I have some backgrounds from the autumn bundle as well. I've got this nice plastic container. One of my friends moved and gave me some of these plastic containers. Very handy. They'll hold a 12-inch block. I went ahead and cut my batting squares and cut some batting for strips because I know it's going to be the same size each month. If I decide to make 4-inch blocks and I end up needing to cut more batting, I know I can use this piece of batting for another project. For today's project, I am making the 8-inch block, so I'll make one teacup block. When you're picking your fabrics for this, if you're making the 8-inch block, you've got a nice big piece of fabric here for the teacup. That's a good opportunity for something that has really big prints. Maybe you like Tula Pink or Cafe. They've got some really big prints and pictures in their fabric lines. Great opportunity to use something like that here. You can also use novelty prints. I've gone ahead and pulled my fabrics. This is a really nice green. It has a little bit of blue to it with floral. This will be my cup. This color is going to be for the handles. This is going to be the background on the block, and then I have my solid Kona bone for the border. I've cut a 9-inch square of batting. Whenever you're calculating your batting for Kimberbell projects that you're going to do the quilt as you go, meaning you're using the background quilting, add an inch to the finished size. So since this is going to be an 8-inch block, I cut a 9-inch square of batting. And for my borders, I have 3-inch wide strips. We're going to talk about borders, how to measure and cut your batting and fabric, and how to select your file size. We'll do that after we make our block. You can see I made a lot of notes. This is the single block with quilting instructions. This comes with your Perfectly Pieced subscription. I recommend printing this off. This block has a lot of pieces. To help me keep track of the pieces, I labeled them. I put a B where there was a background, and then you can see some things are circled, like the 3, the 2, the 4, and the 8. Those are all the same fabric, and 7 and 13 were the same fabrics. So I've labeled fabric 1, 7 and 13, fabric 2, 2, 3, 4, and 8. I made a note that that's the brown. And then my background pieces. So they're piece numbers 1, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, and 15. That helped me when I did my cutting for the block. I drew a box around the 8-inch. And as I went, I either circled or marked things off or crossed them off. That way I knew I'd cut the correct piece. On the side, I also put B for background, 2 for fabric 2, 1 for fabric 1. You can see here on the bottom, they do tell you project batting, 9-inch square. This is the border file that's included this month. You get both 1-inch and 2-inch borders. To make an 8-inch block, I have to use my biggest hoop, which is 8.5 by 14. I've already loaded my no-show mesh stabilizer, or if you've got the Kimberbell stabilizer, load your light mesh cutaway. Let's head over to the machine and make our first block for our mystery quilt. I'm on a Baby Lock Meridian. My files are on USB. I like to have my instructions right here. This is a folding metal book stand. You can find these online. You can find them on Etsy. You might even be able to find them in a local bookstore if you've got one. Let's pull up our file. When you subscribe to Perfectly Pieced, you'll have a folder for your embroidery files. We've got the block files, and you'll see that there's 2 different versions for each size. Here's the 8-inch. I can make it just as a pieced block where you wouldn't do the quilting, you wouldn't use the batting. This would be if you want to make a bunch of these and maybe make a runner or a quilt, and then you want to quilt it with clear blue tiles or send it to a long armor. But I'm going to do the quilt as you go version so I can showcase each block and the special quilting that comes along with it. And then also when we get to the end of the year, all I have to do is sew my blocks together. So I'm going to select this one, the 8-inch. You can see it has that special quilting on it. Set embroidery, and we're ready to go. I have the Glide Pearl on my machine. Since this is our first block in this project, I'm going to go through each step individually, and then as we progress throughout the year, things like batting placement, tack down, and trimming, I'll move through a little faster. But the first thing that stitches out is your batting placement line. You want to grab your batting, cover the placement line. This batting has one side that feels a little bit fuzzier than the other. I'm going to put the fuzzy side up. Make sure I've covered that line, and you can add a piece of your paper tape. I use the Kimberbell paper tape. I'll link that below as well. Make sure you've covered the line, and then we'll stitch the batting tack down. If you use tape, go ahead and peel off the tape. You want to trim away the batting that's outside of that tack down line. Once your batting is trimmed, we're going to stitch out what's called a piecing template. We're going to be building this block in pieces, and it's going to stitch a bunch of lines that are going to help us place our fabric. Piecing template is stitched out. Make sure you've got this diagram handy. This is going to help us keep track of our fabrics. We're going to start with piece 1 fabric. This is going to be one of your background fabrics. It's the little square on the inside of the handle of the cup. Your piece 1 fabric is going to be placed right side up, and you want to make sure to completely cover that little square. I opted to not use any fusible with this project. If you have a really light background fabric and maybe your mug fabric and the handle fabric are really dark, you might want to put fusible on the background. Once you've got that covered, we're going to stitch out a trimming and placement line. You can add tape if you want, but this is sticking really well to the batting. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. You want to trim what's on this side of the trimming and placement line. So this little bit of fabric needs to be trimmed off. I've got that trimmed. This was piece 1. You want to grab your piece 2 fabric. This needs to go right side down. You're going to center it along that trimming and placement line. You can add a piece of tape if you like. When you use the paper tape on the batting, don't push it down really hard on the batting. It can be hard to peel off. So just a light touch. And then we're going to stitch the seam. Once the seam has stitched, you want to take off your tape, flip this open. You can take it to your iron and press it. I'm going to finger press it. I will give my block a complete press before we do the quilting at the end. I'm going to use this piece of tape right there. Hold that in place. We're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line. It's going to go across the top here. You want to trim away this little bit here along the top. Once that's trimmed, grab your piece 3 fabric. This is also handle fabric. Center it along that line, right side down. You can tape it in place if you like. I'm going to go ahead and add a little piece of tape just in case. We're going to stitch the seam. Once the seam is stitched, go ahead and flip, press. I'm going to add a little piece of tape just in case. We're going to stitch out the next trimming and placement line. Same thing, trim away these little extra pieces right here. We're on piece 4, that's the bottom of our handle. I'm going to move this tape just in case. Right side down, center along that trimming and placement line, add a piece of tape if you like, and then stitch the seam. That seam is all stitched. There's a lot of on and off the machine with this kind of project. You have to move it and pull it towards you and flip and fold and trim. So make sure you give yourself time to do this. It's only an 11-minute stitch out, but because of all the moving and the trimming, it's going to take you longer. We're going to stitch out the next trimming and placement line. Trim away that extra bit of fabric. We're ready for piece 5, which is background fabric. If you're using a print in your backgrounds, I recommend not picking anything directional. You can even see in my handle how this piece is at an angle and these are kind of square as far as how it's lined up. It's fine, it's not going to bother me, but if you have a directional background, you need to look at how the block is laid out and then manipulate your fabric to get it cut correctly. We're going to put piece 5 right side down, centered along that line, and then we're going to stitch the seam, flip and press, and then stitch the next trimming and placement line. We're going to cut away this piece right here. Grab your piece 6 fabric, right side down, centered along that seam line, stitch the seam, and then we'll flip and press. Once you've got that flipped and pressed, we stitch out the next trimming and placement line. You can see right here, I do have extra fabric to trim. Right here, it just barely caught the fabric, and I've got a small piece of batting peeking through. If that ever happens, if it's within 1/4 of an inch, you're not going to see it. What's going to happen is we'll trim this, we'll get our next piece of fabric, place it down, and when it stitches the seam, it stitches inside of that line. So that line will go here about 1/4 inch in, and then when I flip my fabric out, that little space with just batting won't be visible anymore. I've got that trimmed. The next piece is piece 7. That's going to be our big piece of fabric here. Check for anything like dark hairs, especially, if you've got dogs or cats or pets, make sure there's nothing here. It probably won't be visible through my fabric, but if you have a lighter fabric, you don't want to have something showing through. We're going to take our piece 7 fabric, right side down, and you're going to center it along that trimming and placement line. Like that, and then we're going to stitch the seam. This is a big piece of fabric. I'm going to go ahead and add a piece of tape just in case. The seam has stitched. Now if you lift this up, see right here, this is what I was talking about. So that area right there where I've got the tiniest little bit of batting poking through that for some reason didn't get completely covered, you're not going to see it because now you're going to take this and flip it and press it. So it ends up being covered. Going to give that a good finger press. I'll add a piece of tape just in case to hold it in place. We'll put one up there, and then I'll put one down here. Light touch because it's on the batting. And we're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line. That's going to be along the bottom. This was piece 7. Piece 8 is down here at the bottom. We want to trim away the extra that's right here at the bottom. I've got that trimmed. Piece 8 is next. Center it along that trimming and placement line. I had to think there for a minute. After it stitches the seam, it's going to flip that way, so that's correct. Center it along that line. Don't put it there. Put it here, right sides together, and add a piece of tape if you want, and then we'll go ahead and stitch the seam. I've got that flipped and pressed. We're going to stitch out another trimming and placement line. Let's have a look at that. Here's my trimming and placement line right here. See where the needle is? That's where it's going to stitch the seam. Do you see how I've got a little bit of open space right here? I think I may end up with some batting poking through. What I'm going to do is press it over. See? I needed to press it a little bit better. I gave that a really good press. In order to get this pressed over, I had to pick out some of that trimming and placement line, so I'm going to back up my machine and restitch that step. I'll show you how to do that in case you've never done that before. Your machine probably has a button like this, needle minus plus. I need to back it up and get to the trimming and placement line. You can move backward or forward by number of stitches or by whole steps. I'm going to go backwards. I think that's the line that I want, but I'm going to hit it one more time. Yep, see, we already did that. So I want that. That's my trimming and placement line. Let's go ahead and stitch that out. Now I know this piece up here right at the top, we're going to have another piece of fabric. So anything above this line of stitching, I'm not concerned with. So when I needle down here, I'm right at the edge of my fabric, which is fine. Let's place our piece of fabric. We're on piece 9, which is background fabric. We're going to center it along that line just like before. Tape it if you need to. And let's cross our fingers. We'll stitch the seam and we'll flip it and we'll see how it comes out. I forgot to trim the green. I can continue stitching the seam, and then before I flip it, I'll just trim this green out of the way. I'll need to trim the green, but let's flip this and let's see how that turned out. If I needle down, this is going to be our next trimming and placement line. It's fine. I'm going to go ahead, trim away this green, and then we want to flip and press. This is flipped and pressed. Let's stitch out that next trimming and placement line. We're going to trim everything on top of that line. Let's take a look at this. I think I'm okay. Go ahead and trim everything outside of the trimming and placement line. We're going to grab piece 10, center it along that trimming and placement line, right side down. You'll notice the edges extend beyond the outside stitching, so that's good because this goes across the whole block. We're going to stitch the seam. I need to remove my tape and flip that up, and let's have a look. Excellent. I don't see any batting. So between this piece here, seam allowance, and then the seam allowance on this piece, and making sure I had that fully pressed over, it came out just fine. We're going to move on to the next trimming and placement line. Trim everything that's outside that line. We're on piece 11, right side down, centered along that line. Tape it if you like, and then stitch the seam. Need to take my tape off, flip that, press it, and then we'll stitch the next trimming and placement line. We want to trim this part away. We are ready for piece 12. Right side down, centered along the stitch line, and we're going to stitch the seam. We need to take off the tape, flip and press, and then we're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line. Trim away these pieces. We're on piece 13. This is the saucer fabric. Place that right side down, centered along that stitch line. You'll see again, this covers the whole length of the block and it extends beyond the outside stitch lines. We're going to stitch the seam, flip, press, and then stitch the next trimming and placement line. We're just about done. After you stitch that trimming and placement line, trim everything outside the line. Going to grab piece 14, right side down, centered along that stitch line. We'll stitch the seam. I'm also going to make sure that my iron is turned back on. When I go to iron my block, I'm going to have my iron hot, but not super ultra scorching hot. You need to be careful that you never place a super hot iron on your stabilizer, whatever kind of stabilizer you're using, and you always want to make sure you peel off your paper tape. That seam has stitched. I want to take my tape off, flip it, press it. I'm just going to place that there to keep it in place. We're going to stitch the next trimming and placement line. Trim everything outside of that line. We're on our last piece, piece number 15. Right side down, center along that trimming and placement line, and stitch out the seam. At this point, I want to get this over to my iron, give it a good press. Take off any and all tape. If you iron on paper tape, you're going to melt the tape. It turns brown, it smells, and it gets stuck on the bottom of your iron. Again, make sure your iron is not super hot. Be careful whenever you're ironing around stabilizer. You don't want to melt the stabilizer. I'm going to use my little Oliso mini iron to press this, and it has settings of 1, 2, and 3. I put it on number 2, so sort of a mid-range heat. I'm going to get this nice and pressed. My block is pressed. The next thing we're going to stitch out is a trimming line. It's going to stitch a box around the entire block. Keep an eye on your machine. Even though you've pressed your block, you've got lots of folds and layers of fabric. You want to make sure your presser foot doesn't get caught on anything. Always be careful with your hands. If you notice, I hit the start-stop button each time I needed to adjust something. The background quilting for this is in 2 parts. You have an option to use 2 different colored threads if you want. We've got what look like little leaves and a vine, so if you wanted to stitch that in one color and then switch to another color for this second part, you can. I'm going to go ahead and stitch this all in the same color. We are all done making our block. Let's go ahead and trim our block, and then we'll talk about borders, and we'll stitch out our borders together for this block. You want to get your block out of your hoop, trim away excess stabilizer. If you've got big pieces at the top and the bottom, you can save those for other projects. I'm going to use my rotating cutting mat and orange pop ruler for this. This is the largest orange pop ruler in the square set. I will link that below. I'll link the Omni Grid mat. This is round. Kimberbell has one that's square. Works a little bit better with the orange pop rulers, but I've had this one for a long time. If you don't have the orange pop rulers, you can trim right along that trimming line. You want to make sure your block trims to 8.5 inches. With the orange pop rulers, if you've never used them before, you line up the block in the center. You line up that outside trimming line with the inside of the ruler. I usually grab my clip tin to help hold it in place. If you're right-handed, you're going to trim on your left side. If you're left-handed, you'll be trimming on your right side. You're going to put your blade inside the notch in the corner and then move it as far over as you can. There's a little wiggle room. You want it all the way to the left. For us righties, if you're doing this on the other side, you want to move it all the way to the right. I'm going to trim right along that stitch line. We'll go through this block for this video, but in future videos I'll probably trim off camera because we're going to be trimming these all the same. We might have something a little different with the borders each month. I'm not sure yet, but the blocks are all going to be trimmed the same. If you're making 4-inch blocks, you'll have to trim them to 4.5 inches square, sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and at the end you'll have an 8.5 inch block. Go ahead and trim that. And then I need to trim on the bottom. My block is trimmed. It looks great. No problem up here where I was concerned about batting showing through. I'm going to set this aside. Let's talk about borders. With this month's Perfectly Pieced, we get the Teacup border files. You get 1 inch and 2 inch width. We're going to be bordering an 8-inch block. I'm going to sew on side borders first, then top, and then bottom. I'm using the 2-inch width. I have a lot of numbers here. We're going to go over to the embroidery machine and I'm going to tell you how I came up with the width and length of my border strips and how I selected the file. In the printed instructions for your borders, you get lots of information. Right here on page 2 on the bottom, there's borders and sashing information charts, gives you fabric cut width, batting size, finish width, file name in the embroidery field, and there's also an explanation about matching up your borders and why the file size given is not always the same as what appears. We're going to step through it though. I find it easier to see this and to look at the files rather than read it. This is good information though. If you've never used Kimberbell borders, you can print that out. Let's pull up our border files. You can see there's 1 inch and 2 inch, and depending on your hoop size, what you select might be different than what I use. Let's just open the 1x7. When you open this, you can look up here on my machine, and it tells you that this file is 1.5 inches wide by 6.97 inches long. It's really close to 7 inches long. It doesn't always work out that way. We're going to look at the 2-inch files. When I looked at the files and how this is going to lay out, I made a note that for the sides of my 8-inch block, I have to have a minimum 2x8, so 2 inches wide, 8 inches long. And I've got a note here to use the 2x12 file. Why did I pick that? We have a 2x10 available and a 2x12 available. Let's look at the 2x10. It's 2.5 inches wide, 8.25 inches long. This is the 2x10 file. Why is that not 10 inches long? Because it has to do with the repeat of the pattern and how these are designed. They're designed to quilt out a piece, slide up a fabric strip, quilt another piece, slide it up, and give you a continuous look. Because the way this repeat works, even though this is the 10-inch long file, it's only 8.25 inches long. This would probably be fine, but I like to have a little bit of extra wiggle room. Makes me a little more comfortable with my project. So let's pull up the 12-inch. This is 2x12. 2x12 is 2.5 inches wide and 11.64 inches long. So see how this one isn't 12 inches long? It's plenty longer than 8 inches, and it gives me lots of extra wiggle room. I'm going to be using that file for the 2 side borders. With your 8-inch block, once we add the borders on either side, and this is for 2-inch borders, I've got 2 plus 8 plus 2, 12 inches. So the top and bottom needs to be a minimum of 2 inches wide. I'm using the 2-inch border and 12 inches long. See how I've noted to use the 2x14 because the 12-inch file is 11.64 inches long. Let's look at the 2x14. The 14-inch file is only 13.15 inches long, but that's fine. I only need 12 inches. Another question you might have is why is it 2.5 inches wide? That's your seam allowance, 1/4 inch on each side. So when they're sewn together in your project, usually they're sewn and then you have binding, 1/4 inch on either side goes away and you're left with a 2-inch finished border. If you're doing the 1-inch project, you just want to pull up your 1-inch borders. Like this is the 1x10. It's actually 9.25 long. That would probably be good to use if you've got a hoop that's big enough. If you don't have a hoop that's big enough, if you're working with a 5x7, you have to work with one of these. The 2x7 border, 6.5 inches long. And if you have your border instructions, on pages 6 and 7, it walks you through how to do the continuous borders. I have videos showing how to do that. I will link a video below in case you're working with a 5x7 hoop and you'll need to stitch out a couple of borders and join them together. I'm going to load the first border I'm going to work with, which is the 2x12. It's 2.5 inches wide. I cut my fabric 3 inches wide and my batting 3 inches wide. I find that gives me enough extra on either side, and we'll step through the border stitch outs. I'm going to hit set, and I need 2 of these. I can grab it and slide it over on my machine. Edit. There's 2 duplicate buttons. If you've never seen any of my videos, I'll run through this really quick for this first video in the series, and then after that I won't explain it again. There's 2 different keys to duplicate on my machine. There's a regular duplicate or duplicate key, and there's a border duplicate key. The border duplicate is the one I like to use. What's the difference? When you use this first one, the regular duplicate, what it will do is it'll go through the first one beginning to end, and then it'll do the next one beginning to end. When you use the border duplicate, it'll do step 1, step 1, step 2, step 2. Let's go ahead and add the second border. We're adding it on the side, so I need to push that button. Add one on the right. Arrows pointing out is going to give me some space. I'm in my largest hoop, so I'll give myself plenty of space. We'll hit OK. I'm going to hit memory, save it to my machine. You can also save it to USB, your computer, or wireless. I just save it to my machine. That way, if something happens and I have to step away, or there's a power outage, or I bump my machine, everything is in place where it needs to be. I'm ready to go. Here's how this looks. This is why I use the border duplicate key. See how it does everything twice? We have batting placement, batting tack down, fabric placement, fabric tack down, and quilting. The other one just runs off the bottom of the screen. I have my pink thread on my machine. My large hoop is loaded with my stabilizer. Let's stitch these out. When you're cutting your batting for borders, especially if you're doing continuous borders, it can be much longer than needed, which you'll see these are a lot longer than I'm going to need. I cut some 3-inch wide strips. We're going to work through the borders. You'll see why it doesn't matter if they're long. For my fabric borders for this size, I cut 3 inches wide by 14 inches long. Again, I looked at the file size on the computer. It was 11.64 inches long. I added 2 inches, which is 13.64. It's easier to measure 14. I measured 14. For the longer borders on top and bottom, 3 inches wide, 16 inches long. Let's go ahead and stitch out the side borders first. I'll be using my pink thread throughout. We're going to start with the batting placement line. I've got both of my batting placement lines stitched out. I'm going to grab 2 pieces of my batting, make sure I'm fuzzy side up. You just want to cover that placement line. I'm going to add a piece of tape at the top, and it does not matter that this extends beyond the end because we're going to trim these, so don't worry about that. Make sure it's nice and smooth. I'll add a piece of tape at the bottom, and I'm going to do the same for this strip. Next, we're going to stitch out the tack down lines. After the tack down lines have stitched, we trim everything that's outside the line. These long pieces here at the bottom, I'm going to save because I can use these for borders in the future. My batting is all trimmed. If you're using a neutral thread, a tip that I have for you is for this next step to switch to a visible thread. We're going to stitch out the fabric placement line. The fabric placement line is going to only be visible from the back side, and it's going to be the perfect width to trim. You won't be able to see it from the front, you're only going to be able to see it from the back. So if you have a neutral thread, put a visible thread on and stitch out this next part, which is the fabric placement line. If you need to switch back to a neutral thread, go ahead and do that. This is a 2.5 inch wide ruler. You see that? When we trim these, we're going to trim them 2.5 inches. It's exactly 2.5 inches between the fabric placement lines we just stitched out. The next thing we're going to do is cover this with our fabric and stitch the tack down. If you look where the needle is, I'm going to hand crank the needle a little bit. Here's your fabric placement. The fabric tacked down 1/8 of an inch inside the fabric placement line. What that means is when these borders are done and we go to trim, if you trim on the line on the front that you see, you're not going to have enough for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've learned this through trial and error. So visible thread for the fabric placement line, and then you can switch back if you need to go to your neutral thread. Let's grab our fabric. I've cut my fabric strips 3 inches wide. I want to make sure to completely cover the placement line. I'm going to tape top. I'm going to add tape to the bottom, which is off the camera, and I'm going to cover my next piece. Next, we're going to stitch out the fabric tack down lines. These are tacked down. Here's that 2.5 inch ruler. If I line it up right here, you can see the pink line is a 1/4 inch inside. So this isn't 2.5 inch between these lines. That's why you don't want to trim on these lines and why I like to use the visible thread for the fabric placement. We'll be trimming these from the back. The next step is to stitch out our quilting. Our side borders are done. I'm going to go ahead and take this out of the hoop, re-hoop some stabilizer, and I'm going to stitch out the top and bottom borders, which are longer. I'll show you how to piece together your batting. Let's load our next file. I'm going with the 14 inch length on this one, and we already went over why. So let's bring up 2x14, and we'll go ahead and set that. Remember, edit, border duplicate on the side, add one, space it out. And I can move this over so I get some more space. Take full advantage of my hoop. I'm going to hit OK, save it to memory, and we're ready to go. That's what I mean by I'll run through things faster the second time around. I'm going to stitch out the batting placement line, and then I'm going to show you how to join a couple pieces of batting. Here's my cutoffs from the last set of borders. You can see they're obviously too short. I do have 2 really clean edges. I'm going to want those to meet in the middle. I'm going to start by laying one piece here up top. I'll go ahead and add a piece of tape, and then I'm going to just place the other one next to it and butt them up against each other. I don't feel like I need to sew these together on my sewing machine. This is a border. It's going to be a quilted border. It's going to go right over the top of that with the quilting, so you won't see the join. I know some people don't like to do that, and in which case you can just cut a new piece of batting, but I do not mind reusing the scraps and getting a full complete piece out of it. In fact, when I do my traditional quilting, I make a lot of what they call frankenbatting if you've got weird pieces that are cut off. But when I do that, if I'm going to use it for a quilt, I will sew the pieces of batting together. That's all set. Want to make sure you cover your placement line and then tack it down. All the rest of the steps are going to be the same. And since we just did that, I'll just run them all to music, but I'll put it on the screen because frankly I think it's fun to watch the machine stitch at super fast speeds. I enjoy watching that when I edit. Let's go ahead and stitch out these borders. These are done. Let's head over to the table and trim our borders, and then we'll attach them to our block. The first thing I'm going to do is just separate the borders, cut off any extra stabilizer I want to save. I've got them all separated, excess stabilizer out of the way. I did not use fusible on these either. I did spray and iron my borders with this faultless heavy finish spray starch. Starch does shrink the fabric a little bit. I have the 2-inch finished borders, so I need to trim mine at 2.5 inches. Just to illustrate this again, since we're over at the table, here's the front. Here's my 2.5 inch ruler. See that? 2 1/4. So if you want to trim these from the front, which I did for the Star Spangled Beauty, I got out my 1/8 of an inch ruler, lined it up, and added 1/8 of an inch. It's easier to trim them from the back. And if you're doing the 1-inch finished borders, 1.5 inches. Here's that fabric placement line. 2.5-inch ruler fits right in between. All I'm going to do right now for all my borders is trim the sides. I'm not going to trim this part and this part yet. We'll trim those as we attach and even them up with our block. I'm going to line up my ruler, and I can even use this 1/4-inch line that's on my ruler and line it up on this line of stitching. It's another kind of a double check. Make sure it's right on top of that line. I want to hold this down, not cut my finger. Be careful. And then we're going to turn it and trim the other side. My border is centered and cut at 2.5 inches. I've got a 1/4 inch here. You can see a little tiny bit of that thread, and a 1/4 inch here. Looks like I could have lined this up a little bit better, but it's going to be just fine. I'm going to go ahead and trim the rest of my borders. You should have 2 shorter borders and 2 longer borders. We're going to attach the sides first. These are directional. What that means is the cup faces up. I'm going to attach mine like this with the saucer facing in toward my block. Here's my block. You can see my border is more than long enough. With this, I have an option of sliding it this way, centering. I can look at the design and decide how I want it placed. When I look at this, I've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This is my center cup. I'm actually going to fold that and give myself a little mark so I know where the center is. I'm going to fold my block, give myself a little mark, line that up. I'm centering it. When this gets cut off, I'll get a full cup here, and this will get cut off down here, and I'll get a full cup here. That's a good way to do that. Now, if I made the shorter size, the one that stitched out to 8 1/4, I wouldn't have any room to move. This gives me a little bit of extra room so I can decide how I want to place my border. I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because I've got a thread that I can easily see, it's really easy to see where my 1/4 inch is. I also have a 1/4 inch guide foot. Either way will work. I'm going to use Aurifil Color 2000, which is a neutral beige. That'll go well with this fabric. The borders are sewn on. Let's go ahead and have a look. Make sure I don't see any of that thread. That looks good. That looks good. I'm going to take this over to my ironing board, and I want to press these seams open. At the end, when we put all of this together and we have to attach it to the backing, we're going to use Stitch in the Ditch. So if these are pressed open, it's going to be easier to do that part. So I'll go give this a good press. Again, being careful that my iron isn't turned up all the way and that I don't melt any of my stabilizer. These are pressed open. We need to trim off the extra border so we can attach the top and the bottom. Before I cut them, I'm just going to double check myself. Make sure, yep, that I didn't accidentally attach the wrong border. I'm good. Okay. I'm going to use this part of the block, line up my ruler against that part of the block. It actually looks like right here I dipped down a little bit. See that? If I line this up here and I have this straight, this side is a little short starting about there. I'm going to make sure to account for that. Line up the ruler, keep it straight, line up on this seam here and this seam here. So now I know this is straight and I can see the fabric kind of coming down here, but it's within a 1/4 inch, so it'll be fine. It'll get caught in the seam allowance as we put on the next border. I just slide that up. I'm going to line up my line on my seam again. That looks good. And then let's line up this one. This is the 14 inch. This is easy to find the center. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to center this part right here. And now when I go to clip this, remember the fabric goes kind of down here. I need to make sure that I clip along this part because that's the correct measurement. I want it against that. That's going to keep my block nice and straight. That's where I cut it crooked. Let's go ahead and do the other side. I've I've got both sides clipped, I'm going to go ahead and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll open them up and I'll press them open from the back and bring it back and show you what it looks like. Here's the back of the block. Everything is pressed open. Let's look at the front. That looks so cute. I love it. I need to trim off the extra, just like before. It looks to me like this part I had the same problem where it's straight, 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 and then it kind of goes in. I'm going to grab a ruler. At this point, our block is 12.5 inches square. You've got your 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch. My block looks crooked on 1/4. I'm going to grab a ruler. I happen to have a 12.5 inch square ruler. Let's set it on top of our block and let's look. I'm going to line up along the top and then we'll go down that side here. Yeah, it is a little bit off. Here is good. That's good, that's good, that's good. Right here it goes in, and then I've got a tiny, tiny bit to cut off here. We're not putting this quilt together until the end of the year. I know right now that this part is short. I'm not going to remember that 12 months from now. I'm going to grab one of my clips and I'm going to put it right here. I do this sometimes with pins if I'm working on a quilt and I'm going to finish it more quickly, but since this is going to sit until the end of the year, I'm going to use a clip. In fact, what I'm going to do is take one of these cutoffs and put it there. I don't want it to squish the border underneath and then not be able to pop that up, and I'll leave myself a note. Short. Now I know. Now there'll be no mistake. I'm going to grab my container, and I put a dryer sheet in the container so it doesn't get all stuffy smelling by the end of the year. Put this block inside, grab my instructions, what I used today, because this also has notes that I made on the thread colors and border files that I used in case I need to refer back to it. I'm going to grab my information sheet and layout and set all of that inside so I don't misplace anything. Thank you for joining me for the first block in our 2026 Perfectly Pieced Mystery Quilt. I'd love to see your blocks. Please join my Facebook group. It's linked below. You have to answer one security question, and I'd love if everybody would post their blocks. It'll be really fun to see this in different fabrics. Let's talk about what else is coming up on my channel. I'll be working on the Perfectly Pieced featured project. That will be coming soon. I've started a pillow along for Sweetheart Street. I'll link the first video below, and in the description box for this video there's a link where you can download this free schedule. We're going to be working on the Sweetheart Street bench pillow a couple blocks per week. We'll finish it before Valentine's Day. I'll also be featuring the new applique of the month club when this comes out. I'm very excited that Kimberbell is going to be providing me with the applique of the month so I can stitch out the tutorials and share these with you. I also have projects from the Feeling Festive Bella box. There's a video already for the Polar Bear rice warmer. There's also one for the Sea Otter rice warmer. The Snow Place Like Home tiling scene. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Find a good place for all your blocks and all your information for this project so you don't misplace anything. And I will see you back next month for the next block in our mystery quilt. See you next time.